Good evening, friends. I'm Laura Gonzalez, the Education and Volunteer Manager here at El Rancho de las Golondrinas, Santa Fe's premier living history museum, located in the beautiful and historic La Cienega Valley. Welcome to the second presentation of our 2021 Speaking of Traditions virtual winter lecture series, co-hosted with the New Mexico Museum of Art and sponsored by landscapes that preserve our heritage. The second talk of this series this evening, Acequias, Mayordomos, and Other Norteño Traditions, is presented by local author and farmer Stanley Crawford and will investigate the vernacular traditions of northern New Mexico, particularly the culture and governance of Acequias. Drawing from his own experiences, he will share his knowledge on small-scale farming and adobe construction and will offer insight into the unique dialect of the region. Mr. Crawford is the author of 4 works of nonfiction, the latest of which is The Garlic Papers, A Small Garlic Farm in an Age of Global Vampires, and 9 novels, the most recent of which is Village. More information on Mr. Crawford and his works can be found on his website, stanleycrawford.net. He teaches Southwest Literature at Colorado College and is currently a member of the Board of Trustees of Jemez Mountains Electric Co-op. He and his wife, Rosemary, have lived and grown garlic and other crops in the Embudo Valley since the early 1970s and are regulars at the Santa Fe Farmers Market at the rail yard. They have 2 children, Adam and Katya. Mr. Crawford will take questions and comments at the end of his presentation. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to welcome and introduce Mr. Stanley Crawford.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you all the staff of Las Golondrinas for inviting me to share. So, as Laura indicated, I'm going to talk about what I call the vernacular traditions of northern New Mexico. And again, as she indicated, this is not from a theoretical or scholarly point of view, but as someone who has practiced them all with maybe one exception, which I'll talk about at the end. These are Hispanic traditions dating from colonial times, but infused with tinctures of Native American Pueblo traditions. First, Acequias. I'm currently just a parciante, a member owner, as it were, of the Acequia del Bosque in Dixon, in the Embudo Valley of northern New Mexico. For a number of years, or maybe even decades, I served as an unpaid comisionado, a commissioner, one of 3 elected every year or every other year by the parciantes. And eventually, I became mayordomo. That wasn't a position I actually wanted. I was a little wary of being the boss of some of the local guys, but actually by the time I was mayordomo, I was part of the landscape, and I was accepted as their boss during the ditch cleanings. The mayordomo, of course, actually runs the ditch, distributes water to the parciantes, repairs the diversion dam, cleans out the Acequia channel in the spring, which is called either La Saca or La Limpia, and repairing leaks and breaks in the ditch bank. As mayordomo, I like to put lots of water in the ditch, and I broke it a number of times. There are some 1,000 acequias in northern New Mexico, and I'm guessing quite a few in southern Colorado. A couple still survive in San Antonio, though I don't know whether they're actually functional. In New Mexico, of course, they are governed by customs brought over by the Spanish colonists, a verbal tradition that has become rooted in New Mexico in the form of legislative statutes, which recognize acequias as bodies politic, subdivisions of the state. But acequia, an Arabic word, points back to ancient traditions of the time of the Moorish occupation of much of the Iberian Peninsula. And I believe scholars have traced the origins of the institution as far back as Yemen. Excuse me. The acequia as an institution is a unique Spanish colonial contribution to this part of the New World, with no equivalent to English or French colonial contributions. The municipality, the school, the church, and other cultural and political structures all have equivalents across the colonizing powers, but not acequias. Acequias are governed democratically by their members, at least ideally. That is not always the case, particularly when you have a wealthy landowner who has a lot more land than other members. And acequias, as it were, flew under the radar of the absolutist regimes of the past, and even today somewhat under the radar of the New Mexico State Engineer Office. And acequias are what you might call works of vernacular engineering. They could well be the oldest engineering works in continuous operation in the United States, in North America, particularly in cases where acequias dug by colonists were improvements on or extensions of similar channels dug by Native American pueblos. And this work was done before metal shovels became affordable and common. What did they use? Sticks, hand, simple shovels made out of hardwood, in earth softened by slowly advancing trickle of water that mapped the course of the acequia along the higher side of the narrow river valleys. Acequias can also be structures of great beauty. There is something startling about coming across a freshly cleaned out acequia channel, winding it through juniper and pinon trees, New Mexico olive, cottonwoods even before they've leafed out, willows on the downside, on the sides of the channel, clean of grass and weeds, clean shaven as it were. It can look like a creation of the environmental artist Andy Goldsworthy. And water in an unexpected place in an arid climate up on a hillside 10 or 15 feet above the agricultural lands of the riparian plain. And acequias often form the border between the rocky juniper pinon woodlands ecological zone up above and the riparian habitat of cottonwood and willows on the downside bank. And of course, acequia channels are often extensions and expansions of the riparian habitat corridors, perhaps a case in which human actions have actually improved wildlife habitats. Not to speak of the fact that most acequias are gravity-fed, not requiring the use of pumps and pipes. There's another aspect of acequia management that is of interest. They are maintained by communal labor. When I first arrived in Dixon over 50 years ago, the Olympia crews were made up of male pacientes and their sons. There were no women workers at the time, though I was told that family women used to come and bring lunch and refreshments during the day to the workers, midday, presumably at a time when before people commonly owned cars and pickups. Participating in the annual cleaning was a way to work off your ditch dues, important in a largely cash-free economy. And with the passing of years, the aging landowners, in my area at least, took to hiring local day workers and eventually even high school kids. The standard refrain at meetings, of course, was always that the young never work as hard as the old guys used to. I've heard that refrain for decades. In time, young women would occasionally participate in the Olympia, and now we commonly have Mayordomos and women commissioners. I believe there's one Acequia in Dixon, in which all three commissioners are women. But the larger point I wish to make is that I believe that this degree of communal labor to maintain and manage a local resource, water, is very unusual in this country and is possibly even unique. I think it's important to educate newcomer landowners, owners on the importance of the Acequia as a unique cultural institution and as a source of community. In the Embudo Valley, this has happened more or less naturally, but there are communities in which newcomers have ignored or even attempted to subvert the authority of an Acequia. I'm not sure how one deals with this problem, but I once suggested at a public forum that signs should be posted on highways where the highways cross Acequia channels, if only to make more public the names of these historic bodies. I can name the 9 Acequias in the Embudo Valley, yet I have no idea of the names of the Velarde or Taos or Peñasco ditches. Ours are the blandly named Martinez Ditch, the Acequia Sancochada, the Acequia de Apodaca, the Acequia del Llano, the Acequia del Bosque, my ditch, the Acequia de la Plaza, and the Acequia de la Ciénaga y la Junta. These names, in effect, form a verbal map of the Embudo Valley. When a colonial community, a land grant community, was established, presumably one of the first public tasks was to dig an Acequia channel. Water was needed for both livestock and for household use. In fact, when we got first to Dixon 50-some years ago, there were several families that were still using the water of an Acequia for domestic use. The water was needed, of course, for livestock and household use, increasingly for orchards and row crops. Acequia, so-called long lot agriculture, is this second vernacular tradition, though in terms of traditional crops, the source here is Native American culture, domesticator and grower of corn, squash, beans, chili, tomatoes. The so-called Columbian exchange, which brought stone fruits and cereal grains to the New World, things came the other way too. There exist in Spanish colonial records names of all the cuttings, seeds, and bulbs brought to New Mexico in the early days, including garlic, which I grew. I started out growing several varieties of corn 50 years ago, and now grow a mix of Old World garlic and New World winter squash. And in the past, I've grown commercial crops of the local chili and tomatoes, all as irrigated by my Acequia. In the Embudo Valley, we used to have some families expert in the growing of the local landrace versions of chili, which unfortunately no longer is the case. And I fear the local chili land races may be on the way to extinction. The distinct flavor of the local chilies, local varieties, it used to be highly valued. When the Spanish colonists arrived in the 17th and 18th centuries and began establishing land grant settlements, the adobe buildings of the pueblos were a somewhat familiar sight, though they were constructed not with adobe bricks, but by puddling adobe up in thin layers to build a wall. The age-old technology of mud brick making is simple. You mix the mud in a small basin or wheelbarrow until it is of the right consistency, not too dry, not too wet, and pour the mud into a wooden frame. And if the mix is right, the mud won't slump when you lift the frame up. Keeping the wooden frame wet in a barrel filled with water helps the lifting process. At first, we made 4 bricks at a time, my wife and I, and two neighbor couples. Each brick weighed 55 pounds when dry. And we made 1,500, again, for the first rooms of our house. And that weight was fine for the lower reaches of the walls, but challenging about 5 or 6 feet. The next year, we reduced the size to 35 pounds each brick, and the following year, we made them even smaller at 17 pounds. Even a child could handle those. Training for this grand building project. Most of my Hispanic neighbors had a hand in building the family house. So it was simply a matter of asking them how to do this or that. Adobe ruins were also instructional in exposing how window and door boxes worked, vigas, latillas, other details. Our modern improvements consisted of pouring a concrete foundation instead of laying a rubble foundation of river rocks, and eventually adding metal roofing to place the first inexpensive but leaky dirt roofs. The traditional dirt roof, of course, is built atop rather big, strong vigas, and and then you put about a foot of dirt on top of the latillas, maybe laying straw down first, and then on top of that, you get dirt from under greasewood plants, which help shed water and snow. Well, our dirt roofs were only about 3 or 4 inches thick, and every time it rained heavily or snowed, we had lots of leaks in the house and pots and pans all over the place. We bought some of the vigas, but we also harvested others from a forest that had suffered a budworm infestation. Our living room floor is a mud floor, the cracks periodically filled with a mix of fine sand and clay. Traditionally, floors were sealed with ox blood, but we used linseed oil instead, reapplying it every couple of years. In siding the house for maximum solar gain and good ventilation, I used Ken Kearns, the owner-built home. At the time, building inspectors almost never entered the villages of the north. In the 70s, the Santa Fe Palace of Governors was not, of course, built to code, and is still standing nicely after hundreds of years. In the end, we didn't have to worry. In New Mexico, farms are not subject to building inspection. Lastly, because northern New Mexico was relatively isolated through the Spanish colonial period, being at the end of the line, as it were, as was also the case during the briefer Mexican colonial period. Spanish-speaking residents were also isolated from the mainstream changes in a spoken language either in Mexico or Spain. This isolation resulted in a unique dialect of Spanish, which probably varies even from village to village, or did at one time, with its scattering of archaic terms and verb conjugations, some of which date back to the Renaissance, to the time of Cervantes. In this vernacular tradition, I have not been able to participate much. Once I cross the border into Mexico, I'm okay with my Spanish, and my Spanish becomes serviceable. Ironically, a Spanish-speaking couple who worked with us and were good friends told me that whenever they went to Mexico, they spoke only English. When I first arrived in northern New Mexico some 50 years ago, I was struck by the fact that there seemed to be little interest by my Hispanic neighbors and new friends to speak to me in Spanish, although they commonly did so among themselves in ways I had trouble understanding. At the time, Norteño Spanish, Manito Spanish, was almost an argot, a language spoken only among the initiated, not shared with outsiders. But in the course of working with a spring cleaning ditch crews, I discovered something very important about language in general. Many of the Acequia workers were young men who had dropped out of school, unable to negotiate the change from Spanish to English imposed in the classroom. After a day of listening to a crew joking and punning and satirizing each other in Spanish, some of which I did understand, in effect playing with their language in ways that were delightful and surprising, I came to realize that these guys owned their language, verbally owned it, in ways that most heavily schooled speakers of English, for example, don't feel they own it. We tend to regard our language as owned by the school, the government, the grammarians, the linguists. We use it, as it were, with their permission. Following the rules of spelling and pronunciation and grammar, they lend it to us on the condition we use it properly, or at least we have internalized these controls to a certain extent. These four Hispanic vernacular traditions are what make northern New Mexico unique. Unfortunately, most are fading with time, owing in part to an influx of outsiders, English and Latino, Spanish-speaking, and under the homogenizing effects of mainstream media in both languages. I would hope that before it's too late, that the local dialect or dialects will be celebrated or even taught in school, and the high school kids will be given credit for participating in the work of cleaning and maintaining the acequias. When my wife and young son came to New Mexico, northern New Mexico, some 50 years ago, we had no idea of the rich cultural gifts awaiting us, or gifts that were to be earned by years of hard work on the acequias, in the fields, and in building our house. So I just wish to thank you, northern New Mexico, and thank you all.
We'll have to share here, Stanley. Sorry, folks. I know some of you had some audio difficulties. We're not quite sure what goes on there. It sounds fine on some of our devices, and I know that some of you at home have a hard time. We apologize. The mics are tested, and they work, and then they just went out on us, and for some of you. So I apologize for that. We're not sure what's going on there. But hopefully we're back online. Everybody's okay. Everybody's with us. Thank you, Stanley. We'd like to open up the floor for any questions or comments that anybody has for Mr. Crawford. Nothing yet? All right, you about covered everything. So do you see the acequia system surviving into the future, or is it a tradition that you see kind of dwindling as time goes by?
Well, it's healthy in Dixon, I would say. In the Embudo Valley, it's still in very good shape, but of course we're facing declining water with global warming, so who knows whether it can survive. But so far, so good. That's not true in every community in northern New Mexico, but it's certainly true of New Mexico. People are joining out, volunteering. The ditches get dug every season, and life goes on.
Absolutely, life goes on, and I love that. I appreciate that as well about northern New Mexico, that these acequia systems are alive and well. I know that in some communities, as people move away from the farming lifestyle, cities kind of come through and take up some of those water rights, and then it's hard to go back. So it's wonderful that these traditions are being held strong by farmers like yourself, and those traditions and that history is being kept alive and well. For those of you that are familiar with Las Golondrinas, we have an acequia madre that comes through our property, something that our operations crew works very hard to maintain. And from that historic ditch, we still feed and water our crops, and hopefully you guys can all come back to Las Golondrinas this season and see that in action. It gets cleaned here in the next couple of months. Vic, do you have any other questions or comments coming through? Oh, what were the 4 vernacular traditions?
The acequias, acequia irrigation culture, the crops, the traditional Native American crops that have been adopted by the colonists and those following. Adobe construction and the archaic dialects of the northern villages of Spanish.
Wonderful. And it's only in northern New Mexico, really, and southern Colorado, that those 4 vernacular traditions are still holding strong?
That's my guess, yes.
Any other questions or comments for Stanley? Oh, very good question. How does one volunteer to clean the acequias? Well, we'll have to talk to our director of operations, who I think is on our broadcast here, listening probably from the comfort of his own office or home. You can get in touch with us here at Las Golondrinas. I'm the best one to contact. My name is Laura Gonzalez. I'm the education and volunteer manager, so I manage all things volunteers, and there's a number of projects that we can get you involved in. I can be reached by email, Laura at Golondrinas. That's just Laura, Laura, at golondrinas.org. Probably Vic can put that in the comments for you all. You can always call our office. But we do that here in the next couple of months, and then by about May 15th, which is another traditional day, around the middle of May, right, Stanley? We start to water and clean and fertilize those crops and get ready for the growing season. Any other questions or comments? The question is, what are the names of the archaic languages?
Well, you wouldn't call them languages, they're more like dialects. And I don't, I've heard the term manito from hermanito, little brother, referred to as referring to the language, the dialects of northern New Mexico. But again, there are probably variants among villages. So it's hard to make much of a generalization, really.
All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Is willow ever used for bank stabilization?
Well, it sort of grows naturally unless an area is constantly burned over every year. So, yeah, it has that. I would say it has that effect, yeah, of naturally stabilizing banks.
So where we can use the natural resources around us, that's pretty helpful. All right, no more questions or comments. If anybody thinks of anything, feel free to put that into the body of the comments there on our Facebook page. Thank you, Mr. Crawford, so much for your time this evening. Again, apologies on the audio difficulties. It's something that we seem to see happen again. We always remind people to turn up their personal devices. A lot of times it's working on our end and on our cell phones, and so we're not quite sure what happens. Maybe because we're out here in the historic boonies of La Cienega. We haven't quite figured it out yet. And thank you all to our wonderful audience once again for turning out this evening, for spending a little time with Las Golondrinas. This is 2 of our winter lecture series. We hope that you'll join us again for the 3rd and final presentation of our virtual Speaking of Traditions winter lecture series. That is scheduled for Tuesday, March 30th at 6 p.m. live right here from the Las Golondrinas Facebook. It's going to be the New Mexico Chili Kings, a presentation by former state historian Dr. Rick Hendricks. We're keeping in accordance with the theme that we set for this Speaking of Tradition series on acequias and climate and culture and the environment, and how all of those beautifully interplay to create the beautiful and unique New Mexico heritage of agriculture, putting the culture in agriculture, as they say. We'd also like to remind you that we have a series of online videos on our Facebook Live, the Golondrinas Live Sessions. So make sure to check out our Facebook, our Instagram, both at SF Golondrinas, for information and details on the next videos in the lineup. You can visit us on our website, golondrinas.org, to sign up for our newsletter and to volunteer. We'll be hosting our volunteer training coming up in March. So again, if anybody has any questions about that, or you're interested in coming out to Las Golondrinas and learning more about these vernacular traditions and New Mexico history, you can contact me, Laura Gonzalez, laura@golondrinas.org. Remember that if you don't have Facebook or you have friends or family that you want to share these videos with, we do post these also to the Las Golondrinas channel on YouTube. So there's a number of ways to keep up with us. Once again, thank you all so much for your time this evening, and we look forward to the next one. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you so much.